issues when it comes to regulating the digital economy is very long, and the challenges are many, especially when it comes to cross-border cooperation. Just to run through a kind of few things, you know, there's questions around data localization, around fake news and content policy, antitrust policy, privacy policy, cybersecurity. There's a number of issues. And so to kick it off, I wanted to ask each of our panelists to identify, in just a couple minutes, identify kind of 2 or 3 issues that you think are very important, or ways that we can think about this complex of issues and try to get to some consensus. Minister, maybe we'll start with you.
Sure. Thank you very much. I think first, in the digital economy context, we have to recognize the impact of global network effects. So it tends towards aggregation, tends towards winner-take-all, and there's a tendency towards, in a way, if you put it in a positive way, the value is created through the network effect. And therefore, we should be looking at regulation through that lens. How do you empower this? If you look at data, for example, it's a case in point. I have resisted using the analogy that data is the new oil, because oil is perishable, whereas data is not. And data accretes in value when you're able to aggregate it, when you're able to organize it, when you're able to connect it. And therefore, we should be working towards efforts that are able to bring, for example, data together rather than keep them apart. So I think when it comes to regulation, I would say there are 3 things that we should be thinking about. The first is whether we need regulation. And I think that horse has bolted already. Even the private sector says we need regulation. But what I would argue is this: the regulation is not just essential from the consumer interest perspective, it's also relevant for businesses. Because if we are not able to create an environment which fosters trust in the digital economic transactions and activity, the space for private sector activity in the digital economy will shrink, and it will not be able to grow in the way that's envisaged. So I think it's a shared interest and a shared responsibility. The second then is what we regulate. And I think on the what you regulate, there's a spectrum. I think at one end, there are issues around security, there are issues around personal data confidentiality. You could go further and say from an industry point of view, what ensures competition and a level playing field and so on. But there are a bunch of other things which we could potentially say is better left either to the private sector to self-regulate or somewhere in between. And that brings me to my third point, which I think is, how do we approach this? We are talking about a digital economy, but I think our approach to regulation of it cannot be binary. And so it's not whether it's government or the private sector. I think what we need to recognize is that there's a spectrum of roles. The government can play certain parts well, because that's the role of government and it helps to foster the trust. There are parts where the private sector can do it, but increasingly I think there's a large middle ground where we need both the public and private sector to work together to come up with creative responses. Not least because I think the space is so dynamic and evolving, it's not in our interest to constrain ourselves through rigid rules when we don't quite know how this is going to pan out.
Do you have an example of an issue that you think falls in that middle ground where government and industry really need to collaborate on a...
Well, I'm sure it'll come up in discussion, but data localization is a case in point. Because I think if you talk to governments and regulators, they will talk about security, personal data, confidentiality, and so on. Now, I think there are some very legitimate interests there, although some disguise that to take a more protectionist approach. But there are some very legitimate interests in there. But it cannot just be left to the governments to find the solutions. In other words, private sector has to step up, especially companies that are operating cross-border, and many are doing so now. What sort of solutions can be put on the table for governments to consider, which will address the confidentiality and security concerns, whilst allowing the flow of data?
Great, thank you. Jean-François, what would you identify as a couple of the most high priority issues or themes for governments to be thinking about?
I'll stay short because I think I would echo a lot of comment. I think some of the interesting dynamics that have emerged recently and that we face on the commercial side on a daily basis, but that also are seen in when it gets to consumer and engaging with customers more broadly for any types of organizations, the notion that intellectual property has been taking new forms and is now able to be spread and shared at an unprecedented level. So what this means is a lot of things that were pretty hard to do are now extremely easy. Understanding people's intention, personalizing products, having personalized conversation, copying style around images, around a piece of text. A lot of these things used to require human brain, which basically was imposing a certain cost, a certain time to make it happen, and a lot of situations were basically we're never seeing it. And now with the contribution of digital information combined with algorithms, a lot of that intellectual property can now be encoded pretty easily, and suddenly situation like fake news, situation like private data spreading across, system being able to manipulate or play with addiction, with people creating all sorts of habits, reinforcing certain types of behavior that would have been impossible to create or put in place are now becoming very easy for any individual or organization to achieve. These are areas that we need to regulate on, we need to make an opinion on, and that essentially goes back to rethinking or reshaping the social contract. So this, there's tons of issues. I've mentioned a few. You think of what should be the role of engagement around our digital self, and where does my digital rights stop as an individual, as a person, and where does a company can start to own the intellectual property that is built on my information. When it gets from a country perspective, what does a country own in terms of digital rights or intellectual property? And in there, there's opportunity for new types of infrastructure to be put in place. And sometimes not just in a way where you limit certain effect or certain dynamics, but also opportunity to invest in building that data infrastructure and that intellectual property. So I'll pause here, but I think that this is really a key issue that then, when you think about it, is basically manifesting itself in most of the areas or industries that both our economies today.
You've been involved in a lot of discussions, multi-stakeholder discussions about some of these issues. Is there an example that comes to mind of a government, say, or a group of parties who have come up with some good answers to some of these issues?
So there's interesting starting points. I mean, there's been tons of national documents that have been produced. I've personally been part of the Canadian version, but also have been, I'm still involved in the ILO expert group on artificial intelligence at the European Commission. We released a report on the topic. The gist of it is that a lot of the laws and a lot of the principles that already exist can just be extended. And we don't need to reinvent the wheel here. Our core value, human rights, a lot of the principles that are there can be basically built on top of. And this work is publicly available. There's 60 documents like that have been published by different groups. Either it's the World Economic Forum, Europe, Canada, and the interesting thing, just concluding on this, is we've studied basically the overlapping opinions, and over 60% of the content of all these documents says the same thing. So there is an opportunity for learning.
There's some hope for agreement in some of these areas. Yeah, great. Professor, what would you identify as some of the most important
Okay, thank you very much. Since I come from China, Peking Research School, I think it is important to give you some basic information on very important legislation in China, because the topic of our discussion is on the regulation of digital economy. You know, a few months ago in China, we adopted a new law on e-commerce. So the new e-commerce law will be served as the fundamental rule regulating the Chinese digital economy. So the topic is proposed by the moderate. Theoretically, we can find answers from this new law, but with one exception, because according to the protection of data privacy, we are doing a special legislation on the protection of personal information, and the law, I think, will be drafted recently. So, what is the main position of this new legislation in China? And after a very brief introduction, I will focus some competition problems regarding the digital economy in China. First of all, the new legislation in China about the e-commerce, its main trend is to encourage the development of digital economy in China. So the supervision, so the regulation will be guided by the so-called principle of inclusive and prudential governance, or prudential regulation. This is the fundamental principle. So in China, the position of the government is when emerge a new model of e-commerce, the government will not interfere. The government will wait a moment and see the consequence of this development and not take steps so rapidly. Another position taken by the Chinese legislator, is that we should give the equal legal treatment to online and offline business models, because we should construct a fair competition environment for every business models. So in China, with the enactment of the new law, the problem of tax and the problem of the legislation, every aspect, the online and offline trade models have the same legal position. This is the third one. The second one. The third point is the deep and comprehensive cooperation between the government and the big platform operator is required by this new law. Everybody knows in this time, the big platform operators such as Alibaba, as Tencent, as JD is very influential, very powerful, and the Chinese government requires the deep and comprehensive cooperation between these private companies and the government. For example, supply the necessary information from the private platform operators to government for their governance. This is a very important issue during the legislation. The last point, I think, the Chinese new legislation on the e-commerce recognize the importance of the self-governance and the autonomy of the platform operators. And they think also the platform operators have some fundamental public functions in regulating activities taking place in the cyberspace.
So, if I could ask then, does this new regulation you spoke of it, Alibaba and these big platforms which operate internationally, does the law apply to their operations globally, or is it all really a domestic Chinese law?
According to this new law, the law applies only to activities which take place in the Chinese territories. But how to defend this conception that in the Chinese territories we have some standards? For example, the company registered in China according to Chinese law, the activities is regarding Chinese customers. And another, the server, the instrument is established in the territory, in the Chinese territory. So according to these different standards, we can define that if these activities will be under the control of the Chinese law. This is
Thank you. You know, you mentioned in your description there about this sort of comprehensive kind of engagement of government and the companies. And that's, you know, a little bit opposite, say, the U.S. Perspective, where the companies have a lot of free reign and government's role is much more limited. And I wonder, as we kind of move into this new era and look at the regulatory options, I mean, are we really going to have like two fundamentally different approaches? One which says, you know, government should really kind of regulate with a strong hand and work closely with the companies all the time, or while another kind of school of thought is like government should do kind of the minimum to establish a playing field and then mostly get out of the way. I mean, is that, do you guys see that as a split that's emerging?
Yes, it's a very interesting question because I'm legal advisor for the legislation of this new law, so I can understand the position of the Chinese government. You know, the space sphere is created a totally new sphere of activities. And the platform operator is very influential in organizing a new market and create a new space for social activities. And from this point of view, the Chinese government adopted a new method of governance. That means governance through platform. So platform will operate a fundamental role during this new mechanism of governance. And it is a partnership, we can say, in some sense, with the government to regulate the cyberspace. So I think this is the fundamental approach.
Well, I would say that, you know, what you're seeing is the evolution of different types of governance models. The US model, for want of a better word, I describe it as a very laissez-faire model. I think the Chinese model, with these evolutions that are being described, is still somewhat sui generis. And then you have, in between, you have the EU's GDPR approach. I'm talking about data governance here. And then in APEC, we've got the CDPR, cross-border rules. And I think what we're seeing is the evolution of standards. And in some ways, I think it's unproductive and unrealistic to think that we can all have the same rules across all geographies. We don't have that when it comes to many other areas, whether it's food regulation or a bunch of other things. What we do is we evolve our rules in the context of our working environment, but we find ways to connect them through common, like terms of trade and so on. And I think that's the same thing that's needed here. And the additional point I would make is, where possible, governments should resist the idea of going too far down the road of regulation in this space. I think we can take a cautious, circumspect stance, but not be in a hurry to draw very hard lines, maybe dotted lines, because we really don't know how this is evolving. And even the private sector, I think if you ask someone today and you ask them again in a year's time, perceptions have changed, will change. So I think those are the two cautionary notes I make, that there is going to be a diversity of regimes. We need to find a common thread through them so that we can continue to transact. And at the same time, we should resist the urge and temptation to regulate fast and regulate in a very deterministic or irresistible way.
Is there an example of where the Singapore government is kind of working with some of its counterpart governments in a specific area to try to find that sort of common ground?
Certainly, I mean, I'll just give one example. I'm sure the others have many of. Personal data protection in Singapore. We have a Personal Data Protection Act. We have to now translate that into guidelines and workable rules for companies. And we are always concerned about striking the balance between, on the one hand, the consumer's legitimate concerns around privacy and safeguarding of data, and on the other hand, legitimate use by businesses in order to harness the data for business purposes which are legitimate and will enhance the benefits for consumers as well. So in that regard, we undertake significant consultation and we put out some consultation documents and also evolve some rules around this. It's a dynamic space. I think it's going to be iterative in the way we deal with this, but it's one of the examples. And I think that's why, taking up the point, be it platforms or large players and so on, we do need to find a way to have a more trusted, regular interchange between government and the private sector in this space especially, because the players, especially those who are successful, tend to be very large, because it's almost a winner-takes-all kind of scenario in many of these cases, hence platforms.
Is this an area, one of the questions we have here is who could take the lead on a more coordinated approach on data privacy protection, or a coordinated global approach? Do you think you're in a position to do that?
You're asking me?
Yeah.
Singapore? Yeah. I think we can, we need to try different things. We are trying not just, not just what we're doing in Singapore, but we're working through ASEAN, we're working within the APEC context, and we need to also make the effort at the multilateral level and try and do the region-to-region type of work. So in a way, it's analogous to the approach to, if you like, free trade agreements. You need a multilateral effort, you need regional or plurilateral efforts, we also need bilateral efforts. And as long as these are not working at cross purposes, but they are sort of reinforcing each other, I think we can find a way forward. It's not going to be certain. I think there will be movements, left and right. But I think in the end, we will forge a pathway forward. So that would be my approach.
Jean-François, who do you think can be a leader around personal data protection? I mean, certainly Europe is
taking the lead there.
Taking the lead. Do you think that's kind of working? Is their approach a good one? And will it?
I think they've discovered a lot of the challenge faster than others because they've been one of the first to go ahead. Their intention is obviously to fix and adjust from what they've learned. A lot of countries have been following kind of the momentum there. The interesting property of Europe is that there's 27 countries that needs to align, so there's already a certain plurality of perspective, and what comes out of there is often something that's an interesting trade-off. Of course, not everybody shares the same exact values, and there's all sorts of consideration that comes into play. I think ASEAN here has an opportunity with a similar type of collaboration going on between the countries to find and have also the motivation and the incentive in place to find standards and alignment there so that companies can compete and build scalable services and products and be able to then be successful in many markets. I think the thing to keep in mind here is we think of data, we talk about data like if it was one thing. And what we need to not forget is that data is a digital representation of what's happening in the world. So data in supply chain has has different property than the old supply chain, but is still influenced by the nature of what it represents. When you go for data for people, it's kind of a similar thing. So data in healthcare has different considerations. So we got to be careful not to try to find a one-size-fits-all solution when it's so impacted by each industry.
Okay, great. For the last question, and a couple of questions here can be kind of summed up as like, what should be done about Google, Facebook, and Amazon? So they're very large, dominant, globally dominant in some ways platforms. I mean, what kind of regulations should governments be bringing to bear vis-a-vis those platforms? I know that's a loaded question.
I can start, yeah. I think these companies have been incredibly innovative, and they discover and actually build some fundamental infrastructure. And to the point and to a degree of success that a certain piece of that infrastructure are now critical for countries to be able to be productive. And I think that's kind of what's been recognized by the law that I understand has been in place in China. I think they need to be addressed that way. It's not that they can't make profit out of it. I think that's fair. But the same way, telecommunication provider has some degree of a certain framework put around them. I think these players are so successful and we're now dependent on them, that there needs to be a certain degree of oversight that is put in place so that it's properly managed. The risk is correct and people are not abused, and then these companies can still try to grow and be successful.
Well, so specifically telecom style regulation is one of the things that people raise, like they should be treated as kind of common carriers, as sort of utility infrastructure. So is that what you would recommend?
Well, I'll put it this way. I think when these companies reach a certain scale, which several of the companies you described are, and they become platforms, the way that you described, then I think you need to start seriously looking at, because they're no longer just private companies providing a service. Very often they take the hue of a regulated, a utility that is commonly used by all. I think a useful rule of thumb is when your name becomes a verb, I think we should start looking at it seriously. So I would say that we should start thinking in terms of when there's scaling, because it's true in so many sectors. It's not just in the social media space. And our approach has really been to work on a collaborative basis and look at the areas where we need to regulate. So we've passed some recent legislation around fake news and so on. Is there a pushback? Of course. Because when you're moving from an unregulated space into some form of regulation, you must expect there to be a pushback. But is it the right thing to do? We think it is. And it's more about, and we think that in the end, it will be proven that by doing this, we're actually creating a more productive and constructive environment in social media in this case. And I think we can take a similar approach to regulation in many of the other sort of large company type or company-dominated spaces that you've identified.
Great. Well, we're about out of time. Thank you very much for your comments.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, gentlemen.